Good evening, everyone. I'm Professor Sally Wheeler and I'm Dean of the ANU College of Law and the University's Pro-Vice-Chancellor for International Strategy. I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's virtual discussion, The Pandemic Paradox of International Law. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to our audience who come from across Australia and the world generally, and to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose land and airwaves we gather. I'm in Canberra, and so that is Ngunnawal country. We pay our respects to their elders past and present. 2020 will be remembered for its disruption on both a local, national and global scale, from bushfires, a huge hailstorm in Canberra, to the COVID-19 pandemic and the rise of social justice movements worldwide. But it's also been an opportunity to unite for a very important occasion, the 60 years of law at ANU. To celebrate this anniversary, the College of Law has presented its Law in Focus programme of events, which have brought together the rich expertise of our legal scholars, alumni and esteemed thought leaders. Tonight, we turn our attention to the unique challenges COVID-19 has presented to international law with respect to three things: patriotism, borders, and equality. These paradoxes have rendered the international legal order's mechanisms for collective action powerless, precisely at the time when they are most needed to fight the pandemic. I'm now going to introduce our distinguished panel. Professor Hilary Charlesworth, Melbourne Laureate Professor at the University of Melbourne and the ANU School of Regulation and Global Governance. Associate Professor Jeremy Farrall, Associate Dean Research at the ANU College of Law. Dr. Imogen Saunders, ANU alumna and Senior Lecturer at the ANU College of Law. And our moderator this evening, Professor Anthea Roberts, a researcher at the ANU School of Regulation and Global Governance, and also an ANU College of Law alumna. So I'm going to hand over now to Professor Anthea Roberts, who will begin our discussion.
Thank you, Sally. I'm absolutely delighted to be here for this as a proud alumni of ANU College of Law, and really delighted to be here to share this particular piece that Associate Professor Jeremy Farrall and Dr. Imogen Saunders have done for the American Journal of International Law. Before we get into the substance of today's event, I just need to share a few housekeeping notes with everyone. So the first point to note is that our webinar is going to be recorded and it's going to be available on the multimedia section of the ANU College of Law website and also on the YouTube channel later this week. The other thing about this webinar is it's interactive, so we will be asking questions of each other, but we'll also really encourage our audience members tonight to engage in this by sending your questions via the Q&A function below. So what I'll do is from time to time, I'll scan through your questions and I'll weave them into the discussion and present them to our panelists to get their viewpoints. So please do put those in the Q&A function. Finally, we've also provided a link to the event's namesake, which is the essay on which this event is based, The Pandemic Paradox of International Law. We've provided that in the chat window, and that provides the context for the themes we will discuss. And we're very, very fortunate that this particular piece, which is part of a symposium for the American Journal of International Law, has just been published, and these are available now online. So with that, to start us off, I'm going to turn the floor over now first to Jeremy Farrall, who will be giving us a quick background to the project that led to this piece, and then introducing the paradox essay. So Jeremy.
Thank you, Anthea. It's an enormous pleasure and a privilege to be participating in this event. And Imogen and I would like to express our gratitude to Professor Sally Wheeler, as well, of course, to you, Anthea, Professor Anthea Roberts, and to Hilary, Professor Hilary Charlesworth. We're particularly grateful to have the two of you international law scholars with us on this panel. You are both towering figures in the field and signature voices of your generations of Australian international law academics. So it's a real privilege and a pleasure, and we're very excited to have you on the panel. Of course, we also count you as close friends, so that doubles the pleasure. We would also like to thank our colleague at the ANU College of Law, Professor Donald Rothwell, whose idea it was to organise a seminar to celebrate the fact that the American Journal of International Law had selected our essay for publication. So thank you to you, Don. And of course, we would like to acknowledge our co-investigators on the Backlash project, which has led to this particular publication. So they include our close ANU Law colleague, Associate Professor Jolyon Ford, as well as our two international collaborators and co-authors on this piece, Professor Peter Danchin from the University of Maryland and Professor Shruti Rana from Indiana University. And finally, as Professor Wheeler mentioned, we're very excited that this webinar forms part of the celebrations of the ANU College of Law's 60th anniversary. And we extend our warm welcome to the members of the ANU community, both present and past. So in our comments, our brief comments to start with, Imogen and I will set out the key elements of our essay. Before we do that, I would like to give you some background on the project that has produced the essay. So the essay is part of a broader research collaboration called the Backlash Project. And that project, whose full title is Navigating the Backlash Against Global Law and Institutions, began life as a 2019 pre-COVID-19 pilot grant under the ANU Global Research Partnerships Scheme. And as I just mentioned, the project has brought together 5 chief investigators. We're all international legal researchers, but we have different passions and interests, and they have really complemented each other as we've sought to publish works on the project. So the Backlash project explores prospective responses by Australia and other states to the backlash against international law and institutions that has unfolded as populist leaders have come to power in countries that were traditionally staunch supporters of the international legal order. And these include most prominently the United States and the United Kingdom. And while the Backlash project began prior to COVID-19, a number of the trends and characteristics that we identified at the heart of the populist backlash against global law institutions have become more pronounced as COVID-19 has spread around the globe. These include an impulse to withdraw from collective commitments and to retreat to the national sphere, a tendency to deny responsibility for negative developments and to seek to shift the blame onto other actors, in particular foreigners, foreign entities, and also minorities. A mistrust of science and expert advice, and finally, a sentimentality for a bygone pre-globalisation, supposedly ideal era when nations were less dependent on global trade and travel. So when we saw the call for papers for a forthcoming Agora edition of the American Journal of International Law on the international legal order and the global pandemic, we thought this would be a great opportunity to apply some of these insights to the rapidly evolving coronavirus context. Let me now introduce the essay we've come to discuss. So the essay begins by noting that the term pandemic derives from the Greek terms pan, which means all, and demos, which means people. A pandemic is thus an epidemic of an infectious agent that has spread across a population, crossing national boundaries and affecting large numbers of people worldwide. Arguably, the most striking feature of the current pandemic is its global reach and effects. There is no single territory or human community that is unaffected by or invulnerable to the spread of the COVID-19 respiratory disease. Now, given that all nations are faced with this common threat, one might have expected them to join together in a common effort to protect their citizens. Yet, as we're all very well aware, this has not happened. Indeed, it's a sad irony that COVID-19 has exposed the inherent logic and necessity of an effective international legal order at the very moment when that order has come under sustained assault by the populist backlash. In the essay, we sketch 3 particular paradoxes that we've identified in the international legal order that have been exposed by the pandemic. So these are not necessarily paradoxes that were created by the pandemic, they've just come into very stark relief since the pandemic onset. So these 3 paradoxes are the patriotism paradox, the border paradox, and the equality paradox. And in my comments, I will set out the patriotism paradox, and then I'll hand over to Imogen, who will set out the other two paradoxes. So the patriotism paradox is that the disengagement from the international legal order in the name of patriotism ultimately weakens rather than strengthens state sovereignty. A distinctive feature of the COVID-19 crisis has been the absence of effective global leadership to drive responses to this escalating threat. International organisations, great powers and their leaders have distinguished themselves by their incapacity or unwillingness to take the steps necessary to respond effectively and collectively to the pandemic. And this vacuum of leadership, which was already apparent prior to onset, is both a symptom and a product of the patriotism paradox. The recent rise of populism and authoritarianism, especially within major Western democracies, has eroded the traditional leadership in multilateral forums of key states such as the US and the United Kingdom. In order to appeal and respond to domestic political forces, leaders in these states have channeled patriotic sentiment to scapegoat the international institutions that have hitherto been so useful to their foreign policy agenda. And a classic example of this scapegoating was President Trump's, or this approach I should say, was President Donald Trump's 2019 statement to the United Nations General Assembly, when he said, "The future does not belong to globalists. The future belongs to patriots. The future belongs to sovereign and independent nations who protect their citizens, respect their neighbours, and honour the differences that make each country special and unique." Now, following this logic, and in the pursuit of an idealised populist notion of sovereignty as patriotism, the United States has withdrawn from the UN Human Rights Council and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change and paralysed the World Trade Organisation's dispute settlement body. The United Kingdom, for its part, has withdrawn from the European Union. And these acts of disengagement from the international legal order have actually accelerated rather than slowed since the onset of COVID-19. So of course, the US has cut funding to the World Health Organization and applied targeted sanctions against prosecutors of the International Criminal Court. The United Kingdom, for its part, has expressed its intention to violate international law through its negotiation of the legal instruments formalising Brexit. As our essay discusses, one direct consequence of the leadership vacuum in international affairs was the UN Security Council's abject failure to meet its responsibilities under the UN Charter and to take effective action against the threat to international peace and security posed by the pandemic. And this was despite the fact that the national interests of the Permanent Five Security Council members were directly engaged as they were each battling substantial outbreaks of COVID-19. They were all in the top 10 countries of incidence of COVID-19 through most of April and May. Indeed, the Security Council's inaction was a case study in how not to exercise collective leadership in the face of a grave global threat. And on that note, I'll hand over to Imogen to discuss the other two paradoxes. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. So, as Jeremy has introduced, I'll be talking about the second and third paradoxes in our essay, which are the border paradox and the equality paradox. So turning first to the border paradox, this links back to those concepts of populism that Jeremy has described. And these are trends that were occurring long before the pandemic, but certain aspects of them became magnified in national responses. And the first way that this occurred was in the quite swift enactment of closure of borders. Many countries, Australia of course included, closed their borders in an effort to halt the spread of COVID-19. Now, this is notable for two reasons. Firstly, it is against the approach recommended, well, required in fact, by the international health regulations, which are the set of international agreements that govern how countries have agreed to respond to global health crises. But secondly, and importantly for our essay, closing of borders fits very neatly with pre-pandemic populist conceptions of national strength. It fits in with ideas of sovereignty that is linked to exclusion, that is linked to control, and is linked to othering. And so for examples of that, we only need to look at things like President Trump's chants of build the wall in his rallies, or indeed the Brexit rhetoric of taking back control. The idea that sovereignty is best asserted as a patriotic sovereignty rather than a global sovereignty. And so when countries closed their borders, especially those who had these populist leaders, these policies were largely supported by the domestic population because they very much fit in with the rhetoric and style of leadership that had already been occurring. And of course, border closure can be effective. I mean, we've seen that here in Australia, we've seen that in New Zealand. But the point that we make in our essay is that border closure cannot be effective in isolation. And the paradox that we observe is it's the very style of populism that embraces an isolationist approach to sovereignty that may also be the reason that other internal measures to fight the spread of COVID are not effective. Now, part of this is the anti-elitism that's present in populism. That is, as Jeremy said, expressed as anti-science. And so when we see this, and we saw this in response to the pandemic, we saw a distrust of scientific advice and a distrust of scientific institutions, expressed on the international level by Trump's withdrawal from the World Health Organization, or the US administration's refusal to follow its own Centre for Disease Control's advice on border closure. But we also see it on the domestic level with a mistrust of advice in terms of mask wearing or other internal restrictions. Now, this domestic mistrust, we argue, is also part of a pandemic-specific expression of an ongoing tension in international law between, on the one hand, the concept of rights, and on the other hand, the need for order to ensure that these rights can be fulfilled. So international law strives to grant rights and freedoms, but always recognises that it is necessary to impose order to ensure such rights and freedoms can be granted. Or sometimes, as is expressed, it's the tension between, on one hand, the collective rights of protection and the individual rights of freedom. And what we argue the border paradox is that these individualistic assertions of sovereignty in terms of closing borders are often echoed in assertions of individual rights on the personal level. So that we have domestic populations who must endure restrictions for the collective protection, such as mask wearing or shutdown or stay-at-home orders, but are unwilling to do so. And that we also have governments who lack the impetus to make such orders or to enforce them. As a result, we argue, even though borders may be closed, the virus is free to circulate exponentially within the domestic population of a state. And so we describe this as the right to protect, but the freedom to infect. And so here it is the right to protect me by closing the borders to the state, but at the same time, the individual assertion of freedom, which means such border closures absent domestic compliance and domestic laws for internal protection can never be successful. Now, this concept of rights also informs the third and our final paradox that we observed, which we termed the equality paradox. Now, as Jeremy set out, we started the essay observing that the word pandemic derives from the Greek word pan, meaning all. But contrary to the roots of the word, the equality paradox is that the COVID-19 pandemic does not affect all the people, or at least it does not affect them all equally. And we argue that the pandemic, in fact, impacts disproportionately on the most vulnerable. And it does so in two key ways. The first is that the shutdown that we saw of government services impacted things like legal aid, welfare services, social services, services that are aimed at protecting the most vulnerable in society. At the same time, we saw that there was a rise in instances of, for example, domestic violence. So it's been estimated that there was a 30% rise in domestic violence cases during the initial shutdown in the US. And this left people who were already vulnerable in an even more vulnerable state without the legal mechanisms of protection that they would normally have available to them. The same thing happened on the international level with asylum seekers. So the border closures that were enacted often affected those seeking asylum, and indeed over 50 states had no exception in their border closures for asylum seekers, which left, again, deeply vulnerable people with nowhere to go and often stranded with no means of protection. So that was the first disproportionate impact. The second was the classifying of essential and non-essential workers, which saw many jobs that are traditionally less well paid and less secure as being classified as essential jobs. So here we're talking about things such as healthcare services, aged care services, sanitation services, essential retail workers in places like supermarkets. And these jobs were classified as essential, and so people had to keep working. And even in those countries, such as Australia, where there was government support, this was not available for people whose jobs were essential and could not stop working. Now, the point we make in our essay is these industries are ones that have been traditionally devalued and are disproportionately staffed by minorities and by women. And these essential workers were exposed to risk in that they had to keep going to work in times and in places that could be quite dangerous in terms of infection rates. And in many places, these were people that also were unable to gain access to adequate personal protection equipment. And this led to a situation which we described in the essay as the workers that were suddenly deemed essential were also revealed to be the most disposable. So the pandemic impacted disproportionately on those least able not to work, but also least able to protect themselves. And the final part of the equality paradox loops back to the idea as expressed in the border paradox of that ongoing unwillingness of some governments to take positive state action to protect rights. And so we noted in the essay a divide between democratic-leaning governments and authoritarian-leaning governments. And we noted that the former, the democratic-leaning governments, took decisive state action to build up healthcare systems, to make contingency plans and to build up resilience in the support of the state, whereas those authoritarian governments refused to take action. This has been described by another essay in our Agora as executive underreach, the idea that some governments not only failed to act in some cases, but actively minimised the severity and spread of the disease. And so this failure to act in some countries, we argue, compounds this unequal effect of the pandemic, as states lack the resilience to protect the most vulnerable. And we conclude that although the pandemic or the virus can spread to all, in practice, its impact has exposed sharp inadequacies in the protection of rights. So that summarises the border and equality paradoxes. To conclude, I just want to remark that we wrote this essay in June, when in a lot of ways the pandemic was still unfolding throughout the world. We concluded at the time that the pandemic had acted as an accelerating agent. It had placed nations into a crucible where they were put between the, we said, perhaps irreconcilable demands of, on one hand, the need for global collective action, and on the other, the turn away from global law and institutions. What then are we looking at 4 months on? Well, even though standing in Australia, it feels like we are emerging from a tunnel. You know, we're seeing numbers are very low nationally. We're seeing the easing of restrictions in Melbourne tonight. But we know that third waves are underway in many countries across the world. And the other thing we know is that these inherent and fundamental tensions that we observed in our essay aren't going away. So that oscillation between freedom and order that international law demands, or the tug between insular populism and engaged multilateralism still remain. And our next question, and one that I'm going to finish on, is to explore what might be done to reinforce or reimagine collective action mechanisms of the international legal order, given their failure both in the face of the populist threat to international law and the watershed moment of COVID-19.
Thank you very much for that. That was a fantastic introduction to the three main concepts from this paper. Look, I invite people, we've started to have some questions in the Q&A, so I'd invite people now to start putting more questions in. But first I'm going to turn over to Hilary Charlesworth, who's going to give some of her own reflections and I believe pose some questions to our two speakers. So Hilary, please come forward.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Anthea. And I'm sitting here in Melbourne on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And so I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, as well as the elders of the Ngunnawal people, on which many of you are. Well, it's a great pleasure to be back at the ANU in this strange virtual way, which would otherwise be impossible because, of course, the borders still separate us here. But it's fantastic to be back at the ANU in spirit at least, both because of the 60th anniversary of the ANU College of Law, which was my home for 6 very happy years, and also the chance to discuss the really rich ideas contained in this very splendid contribution by Jeremy and Imogen and their co-authors in the flagship journal of international law, the American Journal of International Law. So I think that the article is in itself really significant in terms of international legal scholarship in ways that I'll point out, but it's also really a fine tribute to the distinguished history of the ANU College of Law in the field of international law. It's always had a very strong presence and it's been the home to a remarkable bevy of international jurists of great renown. So the task that I've got is to encourage you all to start asking questions. It sounds as though I don't even need to do that, but to sort of kick the process off. So as has been pointed out by Jeremy and Imogen, the article is part of a special issue on what the COVID pandemic means to the international legal order. And I recommend all the 13 articles. They're a wonderful cross-section of ideas about the pandemic. So it might be thought to an international lawyer, on one level, the pandemic really shows up the failure of the international legal system. It seems to have been left to national legal systems to respond to the crisis. And of course, there have been huge variations in the way that this has been done that we're very well aware of. There has been, as many people have pointed out, a lot of turning inwards, a celebration of isolation. Here in Australia, government policies at all levels, the Commonwealth and state and territory, generally speaking, and I'm speaking here of course from Victoria, have really overlooked Australia's human rights treaty obligations, although we haven't made any formal derogation from them. On the other hand, Australia of course has championed the moves within the World Health Organization to investigate the causes of the pandemic. So we seem to have this ambivalence towards the international legal order in this respect. Now, you've heard that Jeremy and Imogen's clear and insightful article with their co-authors Peter Danchin and Shruti Rana frames its analysis very nicely in terms of these 3 paradoxes that limit the way that international law can respond to the pandemic. So patriotism, closing borders, and reinforcement of inequality. Now, they've already given you, and certainly if you read the article, you get a much more subtle account, but I'm just going to rather crudely summarize, I hope I'm getting that point right, by saying that those 3 paradoxes they've spoken about have a common core. And that I take to be, look, the pandemic has a global reach, but international law, for a range of reasons, can't seem to get its act together. So the argument is that the paradoxes reflect the fragility of the international legal system. Indeed, they show up its powerlessness. The diagnosis of these paradoxes is really rich, and the challenge, the rallying cry at the end, the conclusion of the article, is a call for a more effective international legal system. So the authors identify a vacuum of global leadership, those are their words, and they call for effective global leadership. This word effective is doing quite a lot of work, I think, and they also call for an effective international system of monitoring and protection of universal human rights as a way to resolve the paradoxes. Now, the main challenge or provocation I want to make to this wonderful article well, are there other ways of looking at this? So my first question is, and I'll explain it, I'll pose the question and then I'll explain it a little. Has the pandemic shown up the weaknesses of international law in particular, or the weaknesses of legal systems in general in responding to health crises? So it's pretty easy, I think, to identify parallel paradoxes to the 3 paradoxes set out in the article with respect to our own national situation here in Australia. So if we think about patriotism, national patriotism, we've certainly seen that within Australia, or at least there's an echo of it in the revival of state identities. All those premiers saying the great state of Queensland, the great state of Victoria, the great state of Western Australia. It's quite extraordinary to somebody who's lived through other eras. Also, there's an obvious parallel with the closing borders paradox inside Australia, and here in Victoria, we're too acutely aware of the impact of closing borders. And with respect to the inequality paradox, many observers have made the point that within Australia, the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on women, and it's exacerbated racial, economic and social inequalities in Australian society. So in other words, the international legal system isn't alone in failing to grapple with the challenges posed by the pandemic. Hence my question. So we might draw the moral from the pandemic as, well, law alone can never be successful in changing behaviour, which is really pretty well the credo of RegNet, my other ANU home, and Anthea's ANU home. And my point would be, surely we need to look at more complex webs of regulating behaviour than putting all our eggs into a legal basket, expecting too much of a legal system. So we have to use ideas, regulatory ideas drawn from sociology, psychology, anthropology, and linguistics, just to name a few with respect to the pandemic. So my second question is, what about local invocations of international law in the pandemic? How would they bear on Jeremy and Imogen's analysis in the article, which is very much focused on top-down interventions, state and governmental interventions? So what I've noticed, perhaps particularly here in Victoria, is a quite striking phenomenon of groups calling on international human rights guarantees. And they're not necessarily the groups, however the put down is put, the latte sipping or Chardonnay sipping inner city elites. Those aren't the people really talking about human rights here. So we have in Victoria, I don't know how far her images travelled, but Karen of Bunnings, the famous scene in Bunnings early on in the pandemic when we were making masks was made mandatory, when she refused to wear a mask, citing the UN Declaration of 1948. I was very struck by her knowledge of that. But these uses of international law at the local level. And here in Australia, in Victoria at least, we've got at least 11 court cases challenging aspects of the pandemic restrictions, which are all dependent on various forms, various accounts of rights, some of them specifically referencing international human rights law as reflected in the Victorian Charter, for example. There are more creative examples of local uses of human rights that we can see in other jurisdictions. For example, Catherine O'Rourke, the international legal scholar in Belfast, has drawn attention to the Northern Irish Feminist Recovery Plan devised by women's groups there, which one of its primary things is to call for the re-evaluation of care, to say this is an important way through the pandemic. But I was very struck by the fact that that recovery plan relies very much on international human rights treaties as their basis and calls for their specific incorporation in the law in Northern Ireland. So, borrowing from the ideas of a wonderful visitor to the ANU, Sally Engel-Mary, who very tragically recently died, a brilliant scholar who made, I think, at least 3 or 4 trips to the ANU over the last decade, who is a completely brilliant legal anthropologist. And she's drawn attention to the process of what she called vernacularization, which she defined as the extraction of ideas and practices from the universal sphere of international organizations and their translation into ideas and practices that resonate with the values and ways of doing things in local contexts. So it seems to me arguably that what we've got, the uses of international law, perhaps aren't so important top down, but there have been very interesting examples of vernacularization of international law by local groups that are very significant and that perhaps missed if we're only looking at the behaviour of states. My third question or provocation are to query the implications of using the lens of crisis with respect to the pandemic. And that lens, of course, animated the Agora in the American Journal. But I think as soon as we switch to a crisis lens, if we treat the crisis as new, and that idea that this is new, unprecedented, unexpected, once in a lifetime, the biggest issue of our age, as this UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said yesterday, if we keep framing it like that, we keep rediscovering issues and analyse them in a discrete way that maybe isn't necessarily so productive. So the idea that the COVID-19 pandemic is a completely new problem corrals it and separates it from, for example, how is it connected? Is it a manifestation of entrenched capitalist development models? Or is it somehow connected to long-standing indiscriminate damage to the natural world and the environment? These connections are missed if we frame it as a crisis, as a new crisis. Also, one of the problems with analysing an issue as a crisis carries the problem of what I think of as thin description, meaning that the crisis model leads us to concentrate on a single event or series of events and often misses the larger picture. So in this way, this certainly isn't true of Jeremy and Imogen's article at all, but a lot of the analysis of the pandemic, the core problem of the pandemic becomes, for example, about the shortage of personal protective equipment, or it becomes about China's lack of disclosure initially, rather than issues such as the long-standing depletion of public services and the winding back of social security models that the pandemic has exposed. I find the article is so rich, and I think that the article, the third paragraph, deals with the very important issue of the unequal impact of the pandemic is a really significant aspect of the article. But I guess my point is here that the response to that paradox may require more fundamental reform that the international legal system is capable of offering. So with those provocations, I'll finish my comments.
I need to unmute myself. Thank you very much for that, Hilary. And I particularly liked the connection with your ideas that you had published previously about the idea of a discipline in crisis. This is certainly a very nice application of the ideas that you developed in that paper. Can I pass across probably to Jeremy first to respond and then to Imogen?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Hilary, for that, for the lovely things you said, first of all, about our piece and our scholarship, and then for your really thoughtful engagement with those elements that you've identified. I mean, I'm tempted to respond just by saying yes. I completely agree with what you've said. I mean, I don't disagree with any of the questions that you've put. Our analysis, of course, is focusing on the international level, the international sort of the macro top-down level, if you like, by virtue of our response to the call for papers and what we thought were the key areas we wanted to focus on for the purposes of this piece. But I absolutely agree that you know, these tensions, these concerns are not restricted to international law, and that they are more widespread in terms of the possibilities and the limitations of the use of law to regulate problems more generally. Your point about the vernacularization of human rights is a really interesting one, and I guess I guess I would see that also as perhaps an instance of some of the tensions or fault lines between core values that are present in the paradoxes that we identify as part of the COVID-19 response by states are also there, I guess, at a very sort of micro individual level as well. So this debate between the interests of order versus freedom, or the pitting of economy versus health, if you like. There are a range of different sort of conflicts that have come to the fore. And it's not always predictable what sort of actors will be drawing on what sources of norms, of laws, of principles to support their perspective. So yeah, it's very interesting to see people who want to go maskless and sneeze in other people's faces, you know, carrying the flag of human rights in general. That sort of very individualistic interpretation of human rights, as opposed to a more collective frame of human rights that one might apply if one was looking to the wider public good in terms of public health measures. I also absolutely take your point and agree completely about the responses to crisis and how there can be a sort of a knee-jerk reaction and a tendency to try and reinvent the wheel and set aside some of the basic, more thoughtful, more evidence-based responses to these situations, and to draw on frameworks that have been, you know, sort of effective in leading to meaningful regulation, rather than trying to jump in and you know, declare situations of emergency and try and come up with new approaches that are expedient, perhaps. And that saying, you know, never waste a good crisis as well. You get the sense that a lot of sort of authoritarian leaders in particular, but not exclusively, you know, around the world are jumping in and entrenching some of their own interests at the expense of their populations as a consequence of this, the opportunity that crisis provides. So yeah, I think that's probably all that I would want to say on this. At this point, I imagine Imogen will have plenty to add. Thank you.
Imogen.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thank you, Hilary, also for your wonderful comments and provocations. As with Jeremy, I agree completely. I have a few things that I'd like to add. Going back to the idea of the domestic legal expression of the same trends we're talking about, I completely agree. And in terms of, you know, state patriotism, my home state is Western Australia, and Western Australia seems to have taken this as its own personal chance to finally secede once and for all, and go their own way. And some of the, you know, rhetoric coming from the state government there is really quite extraordinary to see. But why I think one of the things that's quite interesting to look at this internationally, not just that, you know, we come from an international perspective, being international lawyers, is in the history of pandemics recently, SARS, occurring in the early 2000s, was described as the first post-Westphalian pandemic. And so the idea was that, you know, SARS came in a world where the idea of the nation-state divide of the Treaty of Westphalia had faded away, and we're in this new age of globalization and cooperation. And a lot of how international law deals with pandemics, and indeed the international health regulations were redrafted after SARS in 2005, operates from that basic assumption that national borders are no longer so important and that states are no longer so insular to be concerned about the nation state at the expense of all else. And I think what we found really interesting is that assumption in the past few years seems to be dropping away again. And so in some ways, I think COVID is the first post-Westphalian pandemic. So we're dealing with this disease now in a context that states are re-increasing national borders and turning away from globalization rather than embracing it. And I think that's what makes the international perspective very interesting to look at, though of course, as you point out, a lot of these things are also echoed at the domestic level and within domestic populations as well. The other thing I wanted to say about the lens of crisis is I completely agree, and one of the things that we really wanted to do in our essay was to try and make it not just about the pandemic. Obviously, it's called the pandemic paradox, but the point we're trying to make is not that this is something that is particular to COVID, rather that COVID has exposed fundamental problems that are present in the international legal system anyway. And I think the far greater challenge and an ongoing one is going to be the issue of climate change. And I think somewhat worryingly that some of the trends we've observed in our essay could also come into play as governments respond to climate change. So the populism or the populist tendency to reject scientific evidence, to withdraw from scientific institutions, to reject the evidence of experts, we saw it here, but we've equally seen it in regards to government responses to warnings on sea level rise and temperature change. And we've seen it in terms of, for example, the Trump withdrawal from the Paris Agreement last year. And so I think it's actually a fairly pessimistic view, unfortunately, that this isn't limited just to the pandemic. This is something that could be ongoing and is going to be something that could be problematic as we deal with other challenges that occur that really do need global cooperation and collective action to try and respond.
Well, on that cheery note about climate change, I might give you a provocation back on that and then turn to some of the questions. So one of my reactions on reading this essay was precisely where you get to, Imogen, which is to ask you what this means for climate change, because I think that there are a lot of parallels there. But I think one of the things that I would find looking ahead to climate change is that some of the associations that we have made up until now, I think may change in the next 10 to 15 years. And one of them is at the moment, I think that there's a real tendency from some of the right-wing approaches to engage in climate denialism. And so on the left, there's often a sense of, well, if you just believe the science and if you would just accept science, then we'll see that there's a problem and we'll act on climate change. I suspect in the next 10 to 15 years and maybe sooner, you're going to see a number of these right-wing groups flip from climate denialism to embrace of the possibility of climate as a real problem. But then the reaction, instead of it being to open their arms and say we're all in this together, is to very strongly close the borders and have a shift from sort of climate denialism to eco-fascism. And there we're going to see a really interesting combination of the environmental approach, which has traditionally been more left-wing and more cosmopolitan, with a sort of eco-fascist approach that will be much more along the lines of the sort of reassertion of sovereignty, reassertion of sort of right-wing populism that you're observing in this essay. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you thought those issues might play out with the kind of paradoxes that you've identified. Jeremy or Imogen? Imogen probably on that one because
I'm happy to answer this one. Look, I think it's a really, really interesting question, and one that I have to be honest, I don't really have an answer to. I think one of the things to draw it back to perhaps is it comes back to that idea of individual rights versus collective protection. And, you know, the narrative that we saw in the context of the pandemic too, with the let the more vulnerable die for the sake of the economy, I think they're really troubling if we think about that in terms of climate change. Because instead of letting the elderly and vulnerable die so that the rest of us can have jobs, we're saying let those people in low-lying countries who are more geographically vulnerable to climate change bear the brunt of it. So those of us lucky enough to live in countries that can protect ourselves can keep living. And I think that's a terrifying prospect, really. And the trouble with climate change in particular, if we're talking about vulnerable and affected populations, is that not only do many of the low-lying countries in the world happen to be countries that are less developed, but also countries that are very vulnerable to change are often island nations, which again lack some of the capacity to withstand these changes by themselves. And I think, you know, we're seeing that where we really need leadership from more developed countries to assist and guarantee that they will both help countries where they can physically, but also, if needs be, accept people from those countries if their lands become uninhabitable. And if we keep going with the trend we've seen, that seems unlikely. If the response is to throw up borders, if the response is to protect your population by excluding and othering, then it seems unlikely that the countries who are most well equipped to protect will in fact step up and do so. So that's my answer. I think you could be right if we go down this track, and I think that's very very scary. And so I think that's one of the things that we do need, as Hilary said, we need to use other ideas, because law might not help here. We might need to have a shift of attitudes, that we actually have a understanding that this is a communal issue that needs to be protected across and beyond national borders. And we can't simply limit it to protecting our own little piece of the world. It has to be about the world as a whole.
And I guess this then links to a general provocation that came up in some of Hilary's first comments, but I think I would like to echo more strongly. But I'd like to echo it in a way that doesn't lead you to say, I agree, because there's been a lot of agreement. So I'm going to say this in a slightly firmer way, which is, I think we're all in agreement on the diagnosis that there's a problem, and a diagnosis that it's a global problem, and a diagnosis that it's been a bit of a disaster. But your prescription is then, so we need a more effective international system. I wonder, if you were in power, whether that's actually what you would say. Because in an ideal world, yes, but I think if one thing that we can learn from this, this coronavirus is that when things really went wrong and we could have really used that, it was not anywhere possible. And it didn't just evolve down to states, it devolved down to states, and it devolved down to areas. It came much closer. And if you had been holding out your hope for an international solution on this, you would be in the worst shape of anyone. So others had to act. Given that, why don't you take your idealist hat off for a second and not say we should have a more effective international system, but put on your realist hat and say, we're clearly not going to have an effective international system. So what do we do then? I dare you to say you agree, but please. Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks. That definitely, that is a very strong provocation, Anthea, and I'm going to resist any invitation to take on the role of a realist. I guess my whole sort of research career has been around trying to reform and renew the multilateral system so that it is more just, more fair, more able to respond to these sorts of crises in a way that does reinforce collective interests and is more likely to lead to world peace, I guess. So I'll remain firmly in the sort of idealist camp. And in terms of I guess perhaps here I might refer a little to our Backlash project methodology, where we explore three three different scenarios in terms of, so once you diagnose what's going on in the backlash, and in this case, in terms of the various paradoxes, what then is the logical next step? And so you're sort of provoking us not to reach for the global level step, I guess. But so the three different scenarios that we anticipate or sort of rehearse are, first of all, and this is the one which works at the international level, and that's to renew and reform the mechanisms that we do have. So, and this is the knee-jerk reaction of a lot of multilateralists and people who've worked in the UN who you know, have like I, who have drunk the UN Kool-Aid and believe that it is possible to make the UN Charter effective, as flawed as it might be in various respects. It's the best thing that we have. So that first scenario involves, reforming. So trying to diagnose what's not working, looking for reform options, and then renewing the system you have now. And in a sense, you have to have faith that that's going to lead somewhere positive, because there is a tradition of it being very difficult to achieve meaningful reform at the UN level. But I guess here I would refer to the statement that was made by the, perhaps the most revered UN Secretary General, Doug Hammarskjöld, who reminded us that the UN was not created to take us to heaven, but to save us from hell. So perhaps it's a matter of expectation management at some level. So anyway, that's the first scenario, which is to renew and reform. The second one, which is perhaps goes a little bit to your realist provocation, is to retreat and realign. So to sort of throw up your hands and give up on the prospect of the international system providing some meaningful protection and meaningful collective action in a moment of crisis, and to say we have to do it ourselves. And so we'll retreat into our national borders, or our communities, our neighbourhoods, our gated communities, if you like. And we'll work with sort of like-minded actors who see things the way we do, diagnose problems the same way we do, and propose solutions that we think are good ones. So that's the second scenario, and perhaps that goes more to your realist frame. And in the heat of a crisis, that I guess in a sense that's what some or most nations have done, as Hilary has pointed out, is to bunker down and to try and grapple with the problems at a very proximate level. The third scenario that we've explored is if you like, even more idealist than the renew and reform one, and that's to reimagine and recreate. And so the idea here is, if we could set aside reality completely and design what would be a meaningful collective set of norms, mechanisms, levers, and embrace citizens of the world, perhaps more directly, what might we end up with? And this third scenario is I think where, there's scope for a lot of inventiveness and creativity, but who knows where that might lead. So that's a scenario that we're interested in exploring, and that would perhaps definitely involve moving beyond just nation states as the critical actors in international affairs and the critical decision makers, and it would, I guess, in some sense, go towards some of the more positive impulses of populism, which is really to move away from this removed global body that is seen as unaccountable and not responding to the needs of people at a local level. So yeah, I think maybe I've sidestepped your provocation a little, but I've said enough. So perhaps I'll see if Imogen has a response as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Anthea, I guess there's two responses I have. One is to say, regardless of whether national and local responses are effective, and inarguably were effective in this pandemic, to a degree, when we're looking more long-term and going back to your example of climate change, there are limits to what countries can do by themselves. You know, so you can protect a population, but in terms of affecting any kind of global change, national leadership isn't going to do it. And, you know, and we see this actually in the arguments against taking action, where people say, oh, well, why should Australia cut our emissions? We're only 3% of the world's total. If we do it by ourselves, it won't make any change. So I think, idealistic or not, there are some problems that just can't be solved by nations acting individually, because they are truly global in scale and effect, and they need international cooperation to do so. But then I want to circle back to one of Hilary's earlier points is, I think the interesting thing that we saw in this pandemic is some of the ideas being expressed at the domestic level really had found their expression first internationally, and in particular the protection of rights. You know, we talk about human rights because that's where they were first had their genesis, is internationally. But of course, human rights protection has to be done domestically. We really rely on domestic governments to protect the rights of their citizens, and that's the way the whole human rights system is set up, that governments undertake to protect the domestic rights of their own citizens. So I think even when we see governments acting domestically in protecting, we're not necessarily seeing a divorce from international ideals. We're just seeing those ideals expressed at the domestic level, which is to say, I'll keep my semi-idealistic hat on at this point.
Hilary, I'm going to turn to you in 1 second, but before I do, I'm just going to first read one of the questions from our audience, and please others put other questions in the Q&A function. I'll read one question from the audience, then I'll turn to get reflections from Hilary, and then I'll open it to you to respond to either or both. So the first question we have from the audience is from Rhonda, and she says, I am interested in some thoughts about reimagining global collective action. For example, where does global leadership come from? Which I think goes very directly to some of the points that you've been making about next steps. With that, let me pass to Hilary to have some reactions and further questions before we go back to our panelists.
Well, I think really the best people to speak on that are going to be Jeremy and Imogen on global leadership, because I'm a little, I think I was wondering whether we were looking in the wrong places, you know, whether by focusing on the international, we were looking in the wrong places. And I guess, I mean, the only just immediate response I just have is to what Imogen just said. It's absolutely true, of course, that the human rights that are being appealed to often come from international law, although I just note in a footnote that the case before the High Court brought by Julian Gurner, a restaurateur in Sorrento, but it's bankrolled by some billionaire somewhere. But I note that that's based, you know, on an implied right of freedom of travel in the Constitution. So as far as I can tell, I haven't seen the pleadings, that it seems to be resolutely based on the Australian Constitution, which of course predates these things, although you could argue, I think with some force, that perhaps the implied rights doctrine might be influenced, although the High Court would never recognise this, by the international. But I guess I didn't want to disagree with anything you'd said. It's more thinking, would it be, rather than, I generally go bleak on these things, but I guess I was trying to offer you a different way of looking at the rather bleak picture that you gave by saying, look, actually, it all depends where you look for international law, and often looking for it at the local level from the bottom up rather than top down may be revealing. It won't always be a consistent picture. There'll be lots of contradictions, but that's a worthwhile vantage point. I realize that it's a lot to say to you, and you're very word limited. You're very pressed for space, and what you accomplished in that space was completely magnificent. So these are counsels of perfection, but a commentator has to find something to pick at. And so that's really was my question. So yes, really interesting that, to me, that groups that don't typically have any interest in or ever resort to the international human rights system in Australia, we're suddenly seeing a lot of talk of this. And I find that extremely, extremely interesting. And will this be a time for sort of resurgence of some sort of rights talk that has really pretty well disappeared from the Commonwealth sphere? That was the only sort of point I was making. So it's, yeah, the location of the inquiry, I guess that's how I'd summarize the provocation.
So I think there we've had some critiques from two different ends in these two questions, which I'll put to you now. One is to say, if you want the global leadership, where does that come from? And the other is to say, instead of looking for the global leadership, perhaps look at leadership from below, or examples of action from below. Jeremy, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah, great, thank you. Well, I guess, you know, one of the major point of the patriotism paradox and the global leadership vacuum is that the leadership's not coming from its traditional sources. So since the United Nations Charter was first created, you know, the key leaders, if you like, have been the United States and to a slightly lesser extent, or to a significantly lesser extent, the United Kingdom through, you know, through their roles on the UN Security Council, through, you know, through the UK's engagement in the European Union and setting collective standards, etc. And so at the moment we have a bit of a vacuum. And so a pragmatist would say that that's likely to be filled by I guess the new generation superpower, which would be China. So if you just sort of stand back and allow a vacuum, then that's where the you know, the leadership is likely to come from. And so collective leadership would be those potentially acting in concert with those who step into the breach. And I guess the hope would be, if you're sort of constrained by the current architecture, that there would be a resurgence of interest in assuming that leadership role on the part of the US and the UK, who remain permanent members in the Security Council, and that there might be a re-engagement in international institutions and international norms in order to make them more effective. So rather than just sort of throwing their hands up and running away from the table. But so where might a truly effective collective action come from? I don't know. I'm not purporting to have the answers here. We you know, as lots of academics like to do, we pose some fun questions, and we are interested in exploring the answers, but we don't propose to have those answers here. And I guess getting back to this idea of populism and the anxiety that power and decision making is too removed from real people. You know, the third scenario that I flagged in terms of reimagining and recreating, and how might you connect more with people around the world in order to ensure that there is a more responsive way of achieving collective action is one of the questions that we're really interested in. So I'm sorry, I don't have any answer on that front. And perhaps I'll hand over to Imogen to see if she has anything to add to that, and in terms of the more local approach.
Yeah, looking at the idea of rights from the ground up, I have a couple of things to say. The first is, I think it's a wonderful idea, and something that I think we do see a bit in international law, not just in the context of the pandemic. And, you know, again, going back to climate change, the idea of sort of climate litigation directly against governments to try and force some kind of action. But what I wanted to say about what I think is actually quite specific to the pandemic is that it did happen to everyone at the same time. And so, you know, this is maybe the first global event that everyone is actually undergoing at the same time. And there's a commonality of experience, whether you're in Melbourne or New York or Paris, that everyone's facing the same virus and everyone's under the same lockdown conditions. And because of that, I think there's this conversation that's happening about rights between people, and that can be good and bad. So the bad is that, you know, you're Karen from Bunnings, yes, she's citing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but she's doing so inaccurately, and she's also citing US constitutional provisions. which, you know, clearly don't apply in Australia. So you have this spread of misinformation, but I think you can also have a real dissemination of ideas at a ground level, which we maybe haven't seen before, simply because we haven't had that context of all actually being in something together. So I think it's a really unique environment for that. And I hope it does mean that there is more groundswell and bottom-up human rights being supported as a result of it.
I'm going to come now to a question in the Q&A from Professor Robert McCorkadale, who everybody here I assume knows. And Robert, nice to see you out there. You are an ANU, I think you taught me principles of constitutional law back in the day. So lovely that you're here with us for this. So I'm going to say that what Robert McCorkadale is doing is not international law from above or below, but international law from the side, which is, he says, your excellent and insightful article seems to assume that the global order is one of states only. How do you see the role of business in the global order during the pandemic, such as where some businesses have acted in ways to reinforce the paradox of inequality, for example, through cutting their supply chains, while other businesses have shown global leadership, such as in cooperation in developing vaccines, even in the absence of state leadership? So in line with Hilary's suggestion of looking elsewhere, what happens if we take our international law glasses off looking at states and look at businesses instead? Who wants to take that one first?
Oh, well, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, it's a great question. And I can only say that if the fifth member of our team had been able to contribute to our pandemic paradox, we might have actually addressed that, because Joe Ford, of course, is an authority on issues of business and human rights. And we are looking to develop that piece into a longer piece, and Joe is part of that team. So perhaps I can say, watch this space, Robert. But obviously, the role of business is also critical in terms of regulating, situations post-crisis, if you like. And Joe's PhD research was looking at how the business sector can be a source of regulation in post-conflict environments. So his insights are really pertinent here. And yeah, it's terrific to see you tuning in, and we look forward to you returning to Canberra at the earliest possibility.
I second that. Imogen, do you want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add briefly to that. I think it's really worthwhile for me to look at it. As Jeremy has said, this is Joe's area of expertise. But I found both the examples given really interesting, because of course governments have their role in this as well. And we've seen government on the trade side. We've seen government halting of exports of PPEs to other personal protective equipment to other countries as a response to the pandemic. And we've seen government export restrictions directly impacting on supply chains, actions that have been pretty roundly condemned, but nonetheless were taken. And of course, in terms of the vaccines, we've seen announcements by the US that they're going to buy all of the vaccine of particular companies for American citizens only. So I think there's definitely something to look at there in terms of business leadership, but also the realisation that, of course, the actions of government impact on what businesses can and can't do in this space as well, and we've seen that in the context of the pandemic.
So I'm going to put one question which I don't expect you to answer immediately, but I want you to think about, which is, many people hope that the vaccine will be a silver bullet. If we get a vaccine, what paradox will that produce? I'll let you have a think about that one. While you're thinking about that, Hilary, do you have any questions that you would like to pose at this point? Hilary, you're on mute.
I wanted to just hear a little bit more from Jeremy when, about his sense that he needs to somehow protect international law or to stand up for it. And I think it's such an interesting thing. It's something of course I understand. And I'm just wondering why we international lawyers feel we need to stand up for our discipline. I think David Kennedy, who of course you quote in your article in a different context, but David Kennedy has made the point that, you know, international law is unusual in that usually people who perhaps teach banking law don't think they have to stand up for banks, and those who teach taxation law don't feel usually they have to stand up for the Australian Tax Office. But why do international lawyers, why do we feel that we have to stand up for it? So I don't really expect an answer. It's just it's something I guess I wonder where that sense, which is very recognisable probably in everybody's international lawyer, but where does it come from and what does it say about the basis of our discipline? But that's a comment rather than a question.
Jeremy.
Well, first of all, the one about, you know, when we get the vaccine, what paradoxes will emerge, I guess I would just respond pretty briefly by saying that these paradoxes will be on steroids, basically. So, I mean, already it's really ugly the way certain, you know, big powers are seeking to dominate the field in terms of the available vaccines. It's highly unlikely that the most needy people will receive vaccines as soon as they're available. This is all assuming that the vaccines are effective and you know, will lead to permanent immunity, which is a big assumption. But already that, I guess we've had you know, a snapshot of what ugliness will result just through the way that nations have sought to monopolise supplies of vaccines for their own citizens, and rather than you know, perhaps coming together collectively to try and put the interests of community ahead of the individual sort of selfish needs. So that's what I would say, is that, I mean, there may well be other paradoxes that will kick in as well. Yeah, but I'll just leave it at that. In terms of why do you feel the need to stand up for international law, I'm not sure, Hilary, if that's a comment on the piece as a whole or just on my responses to questions here. I would see myself not so much as standing up for international law, but perhaps the sort of aspirations and the principles that are enshrined in the United Nations Charter. So the idea that it is possible to have collective action in the collective global good. And you know, I acknowledge that that's an international legal document, but you know, as a reader and a scholar, I'm well aware of the deficiencies of international law, and I guess my scholarly engagements seek to look at the areas that I focus on to try and make them work in a less what's the word I'm looking for? Well, in a more productive way that does tend to promote the ideals that are articulated in the United Nations Charter, rather than to lead to the sorts of you know, exercises of power that disempower others that you often see with the way that you know, that the big powers throw their weight around. Perhaps I'll just leave it at that. Yeah. So over to you, Imogen.
Afraid, Anthea, I don't have a new paradox. I was trying to think of some kind of immunity paradox that I could, you know, come up with something brilliant and sparkling, but I haven't been able to. But really what the paradox I think will be most effective is the equality paradox, because how the vaccine works depends on who gets it. And that is true both internationally, as Jeremy has said. We've seen the posturing of leaders trying to secure it for their domestic populations, and those countries who are more prepared to pay may get more of it. But it also happens on the domestic context. And, you know, I'm speaking from Australia, we're in a very lucky position where we're fairly confident if we get a vaccine, we'll get it, if not for free, for a very affordable price. But if you're coming from a country that doesn't have that kind of robust national healthcare system, that might not be the case. And so it might be a situation where who gets the vaccine, especially if it's an ongoing vaccine that's needed on an annual basis really depends on who can pay for it. And that then leads us again to the position where those most vulnerable are those least protected. And it's the governments who have done the most in terms of investing in protecting their citizens that are most effective, and those that have turned away from doing so and crippled their healthcare systems that can't guarantee the protection for the domestic populations. And I guess the paradox here might be, for some countries like the US, they're the ones who can internationally afford the vaccine, but domestically their citizens might not have equal access to it the same way that we might see in other countries.
So in the chat, there has been a message from Melinda Rankin, Hilary, who says that Rosalind Higgins argued something similar to what you raised. She says, and I quote, "We read of actions supporting international law or the International Court of Justice. Current events put international law in danger. We do not speak of supporting or damaging contract law or tort law. Such language suggests a lack of confidence in the reality of international law, which, like other fields of law, objectively exists and is sometimes complied with and sometimes not." And there was a reply from another member of our audience, Adam Fletcher, who says that those who have worked as international lawyers, particularly for governments such as ours, perhaps do this instinctively. Now, picking up on the last point, there's another comment in the chat, a question in the chat, and I want to say that it's one that picks up on a concept that we've heard in a number of different ways here. So it comes from Alice Edwards, and she says, "Thank you very much for the engaging presentation and for the wonderful commentary from Hilary. I grew up in the era of think globally, act locally for all kinds of international and local challenges. I wonder what this means these days and whether it isn't still relevant. Are we expecting too much of the global system?" And before I put that over to you, I think this actually links not just to Robert's point about businesses, but also to Hilary's point about different webs. And one way to think about this is that with something like a pandemic, which happens from everything from the local through to the global, maybe part of what we want to be developing are fractal concepts. So fractal concepts are concepts that are self-similar at different scales. And one of the fractal concepts I think that we've developed from the pandemic is this idea of isolation, that if there is an individual that has symptoms, they get isolated. If there is a family that has symptoms, they get isolated. If there is a state that has symptoms, they get isolated through to the international level. And that may not only happen in isolation, but the breakdown of isolation may happen in a similar sorts of way. That's an example of a fractal concept that can apply at many different scales. And I think that also goes to what Alice is talking about, which is instead of it being a choice between the local and the global, maybe more of it should be local, or maybe we should be out trying to find these fractal concepts that work at a multiplicity of scales, but also horizontally with different kinds of actors. Imogen or Jeremy?
Well, I'm happy to jump in there. I mean, I guess sort of one initial reaction in terms of think globally, act locally, is that recently we've only been able to act locally, right? I mean, we're all international lawyers who are used to travelling and engaging in person directly with colleagues through conferences, going to the sites of international legal decision making and interviewing officials and judges, diplomats, etc. But we've had to act locally. And so, I mean, I think that phrase, which was very powerful, when we were all growing up, and I think it remains very powerful today. And if you see the way, the younger generations, and I'm thinking of my, 9-year-old and 13-year-old daughters engage with climate change, they have really, they really feel passionate about taking those local acts in order to do something about climate change. And so I think that's really powerful. I also think, interestingly, the COVID-19 sort of lockdowns and the shift that we've all had to make, as we're doing right now, to engaging virtually through Zoom, also is a form of thinking globally and acting locally. And it's in a sense, it's made more accessible a whole range of events and occurrences that previously were not so accessible. And in fact, the very exercise of co-authoring our essay for this issue of the American Journal, which we wrote in in a blisteringly short period of time was made possible through, you know, this new use of technology that, that we really weren't that familiar with 12 months ago. So I guess we were able to think, all four of us to think globally and act locally just through the process of drafting this paper. So yeah, there's a lot of potential to do precisely that, and I think it's really it's been really fun to have that reminder of that influential and important phrase.
Imogen, before I turn to you, can I ask one final question? I think in many ways, when you wrote this in June, July, this was very prescient. You picked up on a lot of the trends that have reinforced and have become clearer over time. I guess one question I have to you, we've only got a few minutes left. What about the pandemic changed your thinking and challenged your beliefs? What is it that you thought before the pandemic that you no longer think? What did you get wrong? You need to come off mute.
Well, my first flippant answer is I thought that I could perhaps, you know, engage with homeschooling my children with the minimum conflict, and that was very, very quickly found out not to be true. In terms of our essay, I think one of the things that we've had to come to terms with or think about is the border paradox. One of our instinctive things that we talked about was that this idea of raising of national borders was not perhaps the answer. And, you know, that was coming from the international health regulations, that was coming from a lot of global thinking about how you deal with disease. And what we've had to realise is that it has been effective. You know, you look at Australia, you look at New Zealand, there are inarguably cases where closing borders has worked. Now, both of those countries have, of course, geographic factors in terms of being island nations that and being relatively small. But I think that was one that, you know, we really had to think about in terms of where our essay was going. And it's one that we're considering to think about as we, you know, work on a longer piece coming from it. And I think what we're really going to be looking at is it's not just the closing of borders, but it's the fact that when many countries closed borders, they did so in a discriminatory way and they did so in a haphazard way. So for many countries, it wasn't simply a almost total travel ban like it's been in Australia, but it was certain travellers from certain countries weren't allowed in. And of course, that had the problem of essentially reshuffling the transit of people, which actually could have, it looks like, accelerated the disease spread in certain ways. And I just want to go back to the idea of the fractal concept, Anthea, because I love that idea. I think it's a brilliant way of thinking about it. But the only point I wanted to make is I think it's something we can say about international law more generally. Because of course, you know, international law is made by people. And the very idea of the collective conscience of mankind, which we see in a lot of the early documents, you know, that's something that I think does have fractal expressions on the local and then is echoed up and up until we see its global expression. And so I think, you know, not just the pandemic, but international law generally, when done right, should actually have those echoes through all the layers, from individuals, through communities, through to the actual international law community.
So we have now reached 7:30, I'm afraid. So I wanted to thank our panelists very much. In particular, I wanted to thank Hilary, Charlesworth, and for coming along and sharing your views on this. We're incredibly excited that that the two of you, Imogen and Jeremy, have published this with the American Journal. I think it's going to be a huge success, this particular symposium, and I think yours is one of the absolute standouts within this symposium. So well done, and we look forward to continuing the discussion as your project continues and as you work this into a longer piece. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.